or have another print disability, which makes reading, holding a book, or turning a page difficult or impossible. The content is copyrighted by the respective publishers. For more information, please visit us on the web at nfradioreading.org.
Hello, this is Kevin Siepel, and for the next hour, I'll be reading from the January 25th issue of the front section of the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Here is an article entitled Nazis, Soviets, and Trump, America's Fixation with Greenland. The idea that Greenland is essential to the United States has returned with a vengeance in the Trump era. By Michael Crowley. The last Nazis on Greenland were captured in October 1944 when American soldiers raided a hidden German weather station on the island's desolate east coast and took dozens of prisoners. Within a year, Germany would be defeated and World War II would be over. But 80 years of both tension and cooperation between Denmark and the United States over Greenland was just beginning, culminating in President Trump's current obsession with acquiring the Arctic island. While the story begins with World War II, it was shaped by the Cold War that followed, in which the United States transformed barren Greenland into a major military asset, populating it with air bases, towering radar sites, and even a never-completed underground bunker complex meant to house nuclear missiles. It was all possible under an agreement with Denmark that granted the United States nearly unlimited military freedom on the island, one that remains in force today. "We did it before, we can do it again," said Daniel Fried, a former senior State Department official who worked on Soviet issues in the 1980s. Whether Mr. Trump understands this history has been a mystery, as European leaders try to convince him to drop his insistence on owning the island. Mr. Trump said on Wednesday that a framework for a deal had been reached, but the details remained murky. In an era before military air power, before Mr. Trump was even born, American military planners gave Greenland little thought. But when Germany invaded and occupied Denmark in 1940, they realized that the island, then a Danish colony sparsely populated by mainly Inuit people, was vulnerable to Nazi control. With airfields perilously close to America's east coast, important mineral reserves, and an ideal location to track weather that shaped battle conditions in Europe, Greenland's defense was considered essential to the United States. It was an idea that would persist for decades before fading briefly after the Cold War and returning with a vengeance in the Trump era. Denmark's king had welcomed the American force and approved a written agreement granting the broad military latitude on the island as long as a threat existed, without giving up any Danish sovereignty. With Germany vanquished and the war over, however, his country was ready to bid the Americans farewell. Danish public opinion was expecting a return to full control of Greenland, explained a study of the matter by the Danish Institute of International Affairs. Washington had other ideas. The advent of long-range bombers had created a new sense of vulnerability, just as the Soviet Union was emerging as a new threat to the United States. Greenland happened to lie along the most direct flight path to the eastern United States from Russia. Greenland's 800,000 square miles make it the world's largest island and stationary aircraft carrier, Time magazine wrote in January 1947. It would be invaluable in either conventional or push-button war as an advanced radar outpost and a forward position for future rocket launching sites. The Americans had no intention of leaving. The bad news was delivered in December 1946 by the U.S. Secretary of State, James F. Burns. During a meeting at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel in New York, Mr. Burns explained to his Danish counterpart, Gustav Rasmussen, that Greenland had become vital to the defense of the United States. While the American military's presence could be extended, Mr. Burns said he had a better idea. Denmark should simply sell Greenland to America. The idea seemed to come as a shock to Mr. Rasmussen, who accurately predicted that his government would reject the idea, according to another State Department memo. But unlike the current blow-up, the matter was handled quietly by both sides, noted Heather Conley, a non-resident senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute who specializes in the Arctic. The Truman administration did not push, partly for fear that Moscow would claim that the United States had stolen land from a European ally. As the Soviet threat grew more vivid in Europe, Denmark became more willing to let American troops stay in Greenland. In 1951, the United States and Denmark reached an agreement uniting their efforts for collective defense under the auspices of the newly formed North Atlantic Treaty Organization. While stressing Denmark's continued sovereignty over the island, the agreement granted the United States broad freedom to construct, install, maintain, and operate facilities and equipment, and to station and house personnel, along with other rights related to military activity. That included deepening harbors and even maintaining postal facilities. The agreement did not include an expiration date, and Denmark has never asserted one. One of the agreement's few limitations was to delineate specific defense areas within which the United States could operate. With the deal in hand, and freshly alarmed by a Soviet-backed communist offensive in Korea, the U.S. military quickly went to work. In a secret crash project, military engineers working around the clock in 24-hour Arctic daylight built a major airbase at Thule in northwest Greenland. Manned by thousands of American personnel, the base's 10,000-foot runway would serve as a launching point for strategic bombers and spy planes. More than a dozen military bases and radar and weather monitoring stations eventually opened across the island. A 1,240-foot tower was erected at Thule for long-wave transmissions to eastern Canada. In 1959, the United States started Project Iceworm, another secret endeavor that envisioned a giant complex of bunkers, dozens of feet underground, meant to house nuclear missiles that could survive a Soviet first strike. The project was deemed unfeasible and abandoned after several years. And as missile technology improved, the United States established more systems meant to provide early warning for a Soviet attack. While they were considered invaluable, the systems were far from foolproof. In October 1960, one U.S. radar system detected a massive Soviet missile launch with near certainty. It turned out that the system had spotted the moon rising over Norway. Denmark raised few objections, satisfied that its sovereignty over Greenland remained protected. To underscore the point, a Danish flag flew alongside the American one at Thule. The arrangement was tested in January 1968 when a U.S. B-52 bomber carrying 4 hydrogen bombs crashed while trying to make an emergency landing at Thule. The bomber had been part of an airborne alert program run by the U.S. Strategic Air Command, which kept several nuclear-armed bombers airborne 24 hours a day. The bombs were incinerated on impact in conventional explosions, but left radioactive traces even after an arduous cleanup. Some Danish politicians expressed outrage that the United States had brought nuclear weapons to the island, although American officials insisted that such weapons were implicitly covered by the 1951 agreement. At the peak of the United States military presence in Greenland during the Cold War, some 10,000 U.S. personnel were stationed on the island. But after the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, the cost of a large footprint on the Arctic island made little sense. Most U.S. installations on Greenland were closed over the next decade, with U.S. activity consolidating at Thule, whose name was changed in 2023 to Pituffik in an acknowledgement of a former Inuit settlement there. It is now a U.S. Space Force base, staffed by about 150 people who manage early warning radar and satellite communications. Mr. Trump argues that Greenland is once again vital to American security, and many national security experts agree. They point to growing Arctic competition with Russia and China over natural resources and shipping lanes as melting ice reshapes the region. Mr. Trump also says that Greenland is crucial to the ambitious Golden Dome missile defense system he hopes to build in the coming years. But Mr. Trump has never made clear why he must control Greenland to serve these needs. Ms. Conley of the American Enterprise Institute said that a solution, if there were one, might mirror the events of the early Cold War. Having been denied ownership of the island, Mr. Trump appears to be considering an enhanced U.S. military presence on Greenland that is part of a new NATO mission to defend the island. That's the right approach, she said. Mr. Fried agreed, but said he wished the process could have played out quietly, the way it did nearly a century ago. Trump could have achieved this without all the drama, he said. End of article. Here's an article entitled Genetic Data from Over 20,000 U.S. Children Misused for Race Science. The National Institutes of Health failed to protect brain scans that an international group of fringe researchers used to argue for the intellectual superiority of white people. By Mike McIntyre. Genetic researchers were seeking children for an ambitious federally funded project to track brain development, a study that they told families could yield invaluable discoveries about DNA's impact on behavior and disease. They also promised that the children's sensitive data would be closely guarded in the decade-long study, which got underway in 2015. Promotional materials included a cartoon of a black child saying it felt good knowing that scientists are taking steps to keep my information safe. The scientists did not keep it safe. A group of fringe researchers thwarted safeguards at the National Institutes of Health and gained access to data from thousands of children. The researchers have used it to produce at least 16 papers purporting to find biological evidence for differences in intelligence between races, ranking ethnicities by IQ scores, and suggesting black people earn less because they are not very smart. Mainstream geneticists have rejected their work as biased and unscientific, yet by relying on genetic and other personal data from the prominent project known as the Adolescent Brain Cognitive Development Study, the researchers gave their theories an air of analytical rigor. Members of the research group were ineligible to obtain data from the ABCD project, but one of them gained access through an American professor who was already being investigated by the NIH over his handling of another child brain study. Their papers have provided fodder for racist posts on social media and white nationalist message boards that have been viewed millions of times. Some of the papers are cited by AI bots like ChatGPT and Grok in response to queries about race and intelligence. On the social media platform X, Grok has referred users to the research more than 24 times this month alone. It's evil, said Dr. Terry L. Jernigan, national co-director of the ABCD study and a neuropsychologist at the University of California, San Diego. It's not just that the science is faulty, but it's being used to advance an unethical agenda. The misuse of the children's data has validated long-standing concerns that hundreds of thousands of Americans' genetic information held by the NIH could fall into the wrong hands. The agency grants widespread access to stimulate new medical discoveries, but critics say the NIH has failed to address the risks that the data, even with personally identifiable details removed, could be misused in unethical research for commercial purposes or by foreign adversaries. At least 63 times since 2007, data from some of the 28 human genomic repositories that the NIH controls was improperly released to researchers, used for unapproved purposes, or made vulnerable to theft, according to government records reviewed by the New York Times. In dozens of cases, the NIH suspended researchers' access and demanded that compromised data be destroyed. But the agency relies heavily on good faith pledges of compliance. You're listening to a reading of articles and features from the front section of the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. The misuse of the data for so-called race science is not the only example of a security failure involving the ABCD study. The Times learned that in 2024, the same data was improperly obtained by an unidentified researcher in China. The data is not allowed to be shared with people in adversarial countries that could use it for blackmail, spy recruitment, or military purposes. But the researcher evaded that prohibition by faking an affiliation with an American university, according to a former NIH official and Dr. Jernigan, who said the agency informed her of the incident. There has been no official public accounting of how the NIH lost control of the children's genetic information. The Chronicle of Higher Education in 2022 reported on the mishandling of data from another child brain study by the same American professor, Brian J. Pesta, who also obtained the ABCD information. But details about the subsequent loss and abuse of the ABC data have not been previously reported. Today, the data continues to be twisted to advance the ideological agenda. When Elon Musk invited ex-users last June to post politically incorrect, divisive facts on the social network, one of Dr. Pesta's collaborators, Jordan Lasker, who often writes about race and intelligence under the name Crémieux, replied with a criticism of affirmative action and said white people had bigger brains than black people. The post, viewed 670,000 times, included a chart that purported to support his claim about brain size and cited the ABCD study as its data source. The conservative commentator Dinesh D'Souza said on X in 2023 that studies showed that black people, who are the rock-solid base of the Democratic Party, have the lowest IQ of any ethnic group. As evidence, he reposted another chart by Mr. Lasker based on ABC data about American 10-year-olds. Scientists said the unauthorized use of the data underscored the need for stronger controls. Several families in the ABCD study said in interviews that they were not told about the misuse of the information and never would have agreed to participate had they known it could be used to promote racial division. End of article. Apologies, that was not the end of the article. There's more. There needs to be an acknowledgement that there are bad faith researchers, he said. The rules and regulations need to catch up with that. In a statement, Lyric Jorgensen, Associate Director of Science Policy at the NIH, said the agency had taken steps to protect the ABCD study. It has introduced a new online portal requiring users to complete training on responsible data use and to pass a knowledge test prior to accessing the data. In response to the fraudulent access by a Chinese researcher, she said, the NIH made enhancements that will prevent this type of incident from happening again. NIH has a long-standing commitment to make the results of NIH-funded research available, she said, noting that it has approved more than 92,000 access requests since 2007. At the same time, NIH takes the protection of all human data very seriously and has numerous safeguards in place. But the Government Accountability Office, a federal watchdog, reported last April that the NIH did not have the resources to properly monitor all the downloads of genetic data and may be missing violations that go unreported by researchers. The data that Dr. Pesta obtained came from 2 studies. In the nationwide ABCD study, more than 11,000 children underwent regular MRIs and clinical tests and had DNA samples taken from their blood or saliva. In a separate study, known as the Philadelphia Neurodevelopmental Cohort, researchers at the University of Pennsylvania collected similar information from about 9,500 children. Data from the projects has generated hundreds of papers on, among other things, the effects of social media on mental health, genetic links to addiction, and the causes of sleep disorders. The data is maintained by the NIH. To gain access, researchers must be tenure-track professors or senior scientists with authorization from their institutions. They also must detail what they plan to do with the information. The NIH can reject proposals that fall outside its guidelines. The agency discourages stigmatizing research that could promote negative stereotypes or cause social detriment. That is in part a nod to eugenics, a discredited field of research asserting that certain races, usually white Europeans, are genetically superior. Such ideas, and the pseudoscientific studies that support them, have been used to justify violence, including by the gunman who killed 10 black people at a supermarket in Buffalo in 2022. In April 2018, Dr. Pesta, who at that time was a management professor at Cleveland State University, submitted a proposal to the NIH. He said he was researching differences in brain size and cognitive abilities in men and women and wanted access to data from the Philadelphia study. Emails unearthed in a lawsuit that Dr. Pesta later brought against the university show that he had been working with a group of race researchers who coached him on how to apply for access. One of them was John G.R. Fuerst, a graduate student from North Carolina. In a March 2018 email, he told Dr. Pesta that focusing on gender differences would be a sneaky way to get the data to also study disparities in intelligence between races, a topic the group believed the NIH would not greenlight. Though Dr. Pesta later submitted updates on further research he wanted to do, none explicitly described the group's true intentions, according to court records. The legal filings also show that another group member, Emil O.W. Kierkegaard, a right-wing blogger in Denmark, suggested Dr. Pesta submit misleading proposals to gain access to additional data sets. I reckon that if we mask the nature of the study with usual medical terms, one can get away with a lot, Mr. Kierkegaard wrote in an email. Getting samples for analyses that one doesn't publish to preserve your reputation are still useful because they allow us to validate our beliefs privately. In an interview, Dr. Pesta denied misleading the NIH and defended his work. I am not a eugenicist, he said. Dr. Pesta's collaborators had a history of scrounging for data to support their fringe theories and of using unreliable methodologies. Mr. Kierkegaard has published dozens of pieces in Mankind Quarterly, a journal known for pushing race science. He has studied penis sizes by race and once looked for correlations between intelligence and first names, concluding that people with non-Western Muslim names had lower IQs. Authorities in Britain blocked Mr. Kierkegaard and his European colleagues from the country's repository of genetic data because they were not bona fide researchers, The Guardian reported in 2024. Another member of Dr. Pesta's group was Mr. Lasker, whose frequent posts online mix data analysis with ideological barbs. He dismissed Supreme Court Justices Ketanji Brown Jackson and Sonia Sotomayor as clearly incompetent affirmative action hires. During the campaign for New York City mayor, Mr. Lasker also share-hacked data with the Times showing that Zoran Mamdani had identified as black or African American on a college application. To finance their research, Dr. Pesta and Mr. Fuerst, the North Carolina graduate student, set up a foundation that received tens of thousands of dollars from the Pioneer Fund, which has a history of promoting eugenics-related research and race science. The fund's president at the time wrote approvingly about the idea of phasing out incompetent cultures by withholding foreign aid and banning migrants of low genetic quality. The NIH approved Dr. Pesta's access to the Philadelphia data, which he and Mr. Fuerst analyzed on a computer in Dr. Pesta's home, according to a transcript of his interview with university investigators. Dr. Pesta also told them that he had uploaded the data without NIH approval to a foreign DNA lab to try to determine the skin color of children in the study. In August 2019, Dr. Pesta, Mr. Fuerst, Mr. Kierkegaard, and Mr. Lasker produced an analysis of the Philadelphia data. Their paper, which appeared in Psych, an online journal that Dr. Pesta edited, had nothing to do with gender differences and brain size, the topic for which Dr. Pesta had initially obtained the data. Instead, it declared that among people of mixed race, those with greater European ancestry were more intelligent, and that genes were probably the reason. These results provide support for a hereditarian model, they wrote. The hereditarian model is the belief that intelligence is largely inherited and not a result of environmental factors. Race science broadens the theory across ancestral groups, asserting that people with a European background tend to perform better than African Americans on IQ tests because they are innately smarter, a view embraced by white supremacists. This runs counter to the scientific consensus that any correlation between a complex trait like intelligence and genes, let alone social constructs like race, is not the same as causation. Research has found that the environment in which people are raised can affect their cognitive abilities. In the United States, for example, any serious analysis must consider how black people endured centuries of slavery and racial discrimination, and now they today face disproportionately high poverty rates and a lack of quality education and health care. But Dr. Pesta and his colleagues did not focus on that. Dr. Pesta said in the interview that his research was scientifically sound and intended to improve the lives of black people by determining the cause of IQ gaps. Because IQ test scores strongly predict human well-being, and African Americans are on the short end of every well-being stick, I think it's an important problem, he said. Mr. Fuerst, Mr. Kierkegaard, and Mr. Lasker did not respond to requests for comment. Their 2019 paper caused a commotion, with scientists criticizing it for discounting possible non-genetic explanations for the IQ gap. Alexander Gusev, a geneticist at Harvard University who has written about the weaponization of genomic data, said such an approach was play acting at doing science. The goal seems to be just to dig through the data and find something that matches a hypothesis about some difference in African Americans versus whites, and then report it without seriously considering any possible caveats, he said. Dr. Hakan Arsen, a geneticist at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, was the co-leader of the study whose data Dr. Pesta used. When the NIH informed him of Dr. Pesta's paper, Dr. Hakan Arsen was outraged, saying its conclusions were not supported by the underlying data. It's most unfortunate that the data you submit in good faith gets abused in this sort of way, Dr. Hekonarsson said. In September 2019, a month after the paper's publication, the NIH ordered Dr. Peska to immediately cease all work with the Philadelphia data and began an investigation into his use of it. But about a year later, while the agency was still investigating, it approved Dr. Peska's request for the ABCD data. The NIH did not respond to a question about why. In 2021, before Dr. Peska published anything based on the ABCD study, the NIH accused him of misconduct with the Philadelphia data and suspended his access to its repositories for 3 years. It was the most severe penalty the agency had ever issued. Cleveland State fired him the following year. Dr. Peska told university investigators that he had destroyed the data as instructed by the NIH, but he could not say for certain whether Mr. Fuerst had made a copy from the computer in Dr. Peska's home. He said he had distanced himself from Mr. Fuerst, who had gone a little bit rogue. Mr. Fuerst and his colleagues have continued to cite the ABCD data. In 2024, for example, they published a book that compiled many of their papers and mentioned the ABCD study about 200 times. Mr. Fuerst's co-authors have included other people ineligible to access the data, such as a professor at a state university in Russia and a freelance researcher in China who is publicly acknowledged having no formal credentials in intelligence research. The papers provide fuel for more forays into race science. Invoking their own previous analyses of the child brain studies, Dr. Peska, Mr. Kierkegaard, and Mr. Fuerst have produced new papers suggesting that black people earn less than white people because they are less intelligent. You're listening to a reading of articles and features from the front section of the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. One of those papers, in turn, was cited in a Substack article last April asserting that black people's supposed lack of intelligence was the source of the racial income gap. The article was picked up by an online magazine with tens of thousands of viewers. Another paper, co-authored by Mr. Kierkegaard, was limited by what he acknowledged were small sample sizes and a lack of non-genetic data. Those shortcomings did not stop him from trumpeting the findings online as proof that genetic ancestry, not social race, explains observed gaps in social status. The scientists leading the ABCD study decided not to tell participants that their data had been misused for race research. Parents and their children, who are now adults nearing the end of the decade-long study, reacted with surprise and dismay when the Times told them what had happened. They said they deserved to learn about it from the study's organizers. Scientists said they chose not to inform the families because they believed doing so could cause more harm than good. We have struggled with the decision, said Angela Laird at Florida International University, who helps run the ABCD study in South Florida. Many of her study participants are black and Hispanic, and are really the targets of these racist studies, Dr. Laird said. I do believe that if we sat our families down and read them the studies, they would be upset, and in many cases that is likely an understatement. The organizers of the Philadelphia study didn't tell families either. Dr. Hekonarsson said that because children's identities weren't disclosed, informing parents was not something that was felt to be needed. While some scientists have pushed the NIH to limit how sensitive genetic data can be used in research, there is little indication the Trump administration agrees, and there are signs it is moving in the opposite direction. Adam Kandu, the top lawyer at the Federal Communications Commission, wrote a law review article in 2024 criticizing the NIH's discouragement of stigmatizing research. He compared it to the persecution of Galileo. A liberal society should support the search for truth, Mr. Candu wrote, regardless of how uncomfortable and unsettling that truth turns out to be. Dr. Pesta has claimed that he faced such persecution. He sued Cleveland State for wrongful termination, saying he was a victim of cancel culture. A federal judge dismissed his lawsuit. He ruled that Dr. Pesta was fired because of his own misconduct with the restricted data, not the content of his research. A federal appeals court affirmed the decision in November. Still, Dr. Pesta and his fellow race researchers have reason for optimism. The pendulum of public policy, Dr. Pesta said, is swinging in terms of acceptance of even asking the questions. A few days after President Trump won the 2024 election, Mr. Kierkegaard happily noted on his website that incoming Vice President J.D. Vance followed compatriots like Mr. Lasker on social media. His post featured an image of a red "Make Science Great Again" hat. Within weeks of Mr. Trump taking office, the NIH made a little-noticed revision to the guidelines on access to a large genetic database. Its description of what constituted stigmatizing research no longer included any reference to skin color, ancestry, and ethnicity. End of article. Here's an opinion piece, a guest essay titled "GOP Congressman, We Need to Wake Up After Minneapolis." It is by Mike Lawler, who is a Republican who represents New York's 17th Congressional District. The deaths of Renee Good and Alex Pretty in Minneapolis this month were tragic and preventable. No matter where you stand on immigration enforcement, the shootings show that what the country has been doing is not working. The loudest voices on each extreme have retreated to their usual corners. They have an interest in keeping our immigration problems unsolved and politically divisive. Everyone else must see that Congress and the President need to embrace a new, comprehensive national immigration policy that acknowledges Americans' many legitimate concerns about how the government has conducted immigration policy. That starts with reviewing how we got here. During President Joe Biden's term, lenient border policies and foolish state and local laws offering shelter and benefits to illegal immigrants resulted in millions of migrants entering the United States, overwhelming our cities, our legal and public education systems, and our social safety net. Americans demanded action, electing Donald Trump in 2024. Now, just months from the November midterm elections, polls suggest that Americans are increasingly concerned about the Department of Homeland Security's enforcement operations, including in Minneapolis. Americans do not want chaos. They want a common-sense bipartisan solution. During the Biden and Trump administrations, I have helped write bills with anyone from any party who would collaborate with me on finding that solution. A workable plan requires a secure border. Thankfully, the Trump administration has effectively stopped illegal border crossings and deported by its own count over 675,000 illegal immigrants. Any balanced immigration policy would preserve and expand on this progress, but do it humanely. Agents from Immigration and Customs Enforcement and Customs and Border Protection are conducting forceful operations in American communities. They should reassess their current tactics. Irresponsible politicians have increased the danger by delegitimizing ICE, with some calling to abolish it, and standing behind sanctuary city policies that restrict necessary cooperation between immigration enforcement officers and state and local police. Local police departments are better suited to interact with the public. Collaboration among federal, state, and local law enforcement officials might have prevented some of the chaos in Minneapolis. Collaboration should start now. The FBI and state and local departments should together investigate the deaths of Renee Good and Alex Pretty. A transparent and accountable process that protects the rights of everyone involved, including the deceased and their families, would ensure all relevant evidence is collected and bolster the public's confidence in immigration enforcement and our justice system. Congressional scrutiny would help, too. Lawmakers should immediately convene hearings with the leadership of Homeland Security, ICE, and Border Patrol and Citizenship and Immigration Services, not to provide a platform for partisan grandstanding, but to promote an honest national conversation about immigration enforcement. After tensions have calmed, Congress can then piece together the rest of an immigration plan that settles the issue. Along with building on Mr. Trump's border policies, a realistic plan would provide a path to legal status, not citizenship, for long-term illegal immigrants without criminal records. This path would be rigorous and fair, and it would aim to keep families together. Fair means those who benefit would face mandatory work requirements, forego public assistance, and pay fines and any back taxes they might owe. Congress would have to change the legal immigration system, too. Lawmakers should create a system in which applicants' merit matters more than it does now, better accounting for the country's economic needs. I am the husband of a naturalized citizen. My wife came to the United States in pursuit of a better life. I will always fight to provide opportunity to others who have the potential and desire to contribute to America's success. We must be a nation of laws, but also one that offers dignity and compassion to those seeking to pursue their American dream. The events of the past several years show that there will be no Democratic or Republican solution on immigration, only an American one. After 40 years of failure, and now 2 more deaths that did not need to occur, my colleagues and I should feel only more profoundly the responsibility to rebuild trust and act in America's common interest. End of guest essay. Here's an opinion piece titled The Un-American President by Maureen Dowd. I saw the charismatic Italian conductor Gianandrea Noseda lead the National Symphony Orchestra on Thursday in a program called Songs of Destiny and Fate. The Brahms, Bach, and Vivaldi were a soothing tonic to President Trump's soundtrack, which is akin to the stabbing, shrieking Bernard Herrmann score for Hitchcock's Psycho shower scene. The concert began with the Star-Spangled Banner. Even before Trump blasphemously interloped into the Kennedy Center's name, horrible Trump culture war enforcer Rick Grenell had dictated that all National Symphony Orchestra concerts begin with the national anthem. I'm always happy to put my hand on my heart and listen to the ode to our flag and this heaven-rescued land. My father always had an American flag flying and took it down at sundown as a sign of respect, which was the custom then. When I won a Pulitzer, New York's very cool Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan sent me a flag that had flown over the Capitol, which I cherish. But it felt tinny to be force-fed the Star-Spangled Banner by our solipsistic president and his creepy sycophants, who show nothing but disdain for the Constitution and American values. It was our country's destiny to reflect ideals that made us an incandescent beacon for democracy, but Trump has pulverized those ideals. We are now seen as sinister, selfish, unruly, and at everybody's throat. Jack Smith's testimony before Congress on Thursday was a stinging reminder that Trump tried to overthrow the government and wickedly put lawmakers and his own vice president in harm's way. Our investigation revealed that Donald Trump is the person who caused January 6th, that it was foreseeable to him, and that he sought to exploit the violence, Smith said. It is heartbreaking that on the cusp of our 250th anniversary, we have a president who is perverting all the values our country was founded on, looking out for one another, respecting one another's rights. America is not supposed to be a place where an angel-faced 5-year-old named Liam with a floppy-eared hat and a Spider-Man backpack get seized and taken to a detention center by men in masks. The American leader is meant to be a unifier, a strong and soothing presence in the world. Trump is an anarchic toddler, constantly causing upheaval across the globe, transgressing and remaking everything in his helter-skelter image. He has no interest in fireside chats. He wants to set fires. He's more about droit de seigneur than noblesse oblige. He feels entitled to whatever he wants, from Greenland to Canada to the Kennedy Center to a Nobel Prize he didn't win. Unlike previous presidents, he isn't countering Russia, he's catering to it. He disparaged the NATO troops who died for us in Afghanistan and belittled our nicest neighbor, claiming that Canada lives because of the United States. Demanding Greenland, which he kept calling Iceland, he winged to global leaders at Davos, "All I want is a piece of ice." The depth of his shallowness is infinite. One Canadian columnist asked, how would Trump behave differently if he was legitimately losing his mind? I understand the importance of legal immigration. My Irish father fought in the infantry in World War I to earn his citizenship. Nobody wants illegal criminals here. President Joe Biden let the border run amok. But in the New York Times Siena University poll, a sizable majority said ICE had gone too far. Trump responded by saying he would expand his lawsuit against the Times to include the poll, because his rampaging vanity cannot accept falling numbers. The poll indicated that 42% of voters said he was ramping up to be one of the worst presidents in American history. We have watched in horror as Minneapolis has morphed into an eerie war zone. ICE claiming that its officers are allowed to barge into people's homes without judicial warrants, and ICE agents shooting an unarmed mom with stuffed animals in her glove compartment 3 times until she was dead. ICE dragging a Minnesota man, a Hmong immigrant and naturalized U.S. citizen with no criminal record, out of his house into the snow wearing only his underwear and Crocs. ICE demanding detaining 4 children, including little Liam from one school district. An FBI agent who wanted to investigate the ICE agent who shot the mom resigned after Bureau officials told her to stop her inquiry. Why detain a 5-year-old? A flustered Zena Stenvik, the town superintendent, keened at a press conference. It is clear that the Trump crowd sees no difference between a criminal who crossed into the country illegally and a family that has applied for asylum and is doing everything the right way to stay here. My parents inculcated us with patriotism and gratitude for this country. I grew up surrounded by men in uniform. My mother carried around a pocket-sized Constitution in her purse, along with miniature bottles of Tabasco. She did not want to see us on July 4th if we were not in red, white, and blue. I know what America is meant to stand for. Trump has made America un-American. End of article. You're listening to a reading of articles and features from the front section of the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Here's an opinion piece entitled The Carney Doctrine by David French. There will be more twists and turns, highs and lows, but I'm afraid it's time to recognize a sad reality. It's over. This week, 2 things happened that, taken together, send a clear signal to the United States and the world. The American-led alliance of democracies is in the midst of a rupture. We have broken faith with our allies, and our allies are choosing resistance over submission to Trump's aggression and greed. Before we get to the dramatic developments in Davos, Switzerland, let's set the stage. On Sunday night, we learned that President Trump sent the Norwegian Prime Minister Jonas Gahr Store a message that can only be described as deranged and delusional. You may have read it before, but please read it again. "Dear Jonas," it began, "considering your country decided not to give me the Nobel Peace Prize for having stopped 8 wars, plus, I no longer feel an obligation to think purely of peace, although it will always be predominant, but can now think about what is good and proper for the United States of America." Trump, incredibly enough, was tying his desire to acquire Greenland to the Nobel Committee's awarding someone else the Nobel Peace Prize, a decision that he wrongly attributed to the government of Norway. Making everything worse, even as Trump is behaving in a demonstrably irrational way, America's vaunted checks and balances are failing. Impeachment and conviction are off the table. There is no chance that Trump's cabinet of sycophants would invoke the 25th Amendment. Congress is led by invertebrates, with many of them apparently convinced that he'll subjugate the world in much the same way that he subjugated them, through threats, bluster, and the unyielding support of millions in the MAGA mob. On Tuesday, however, the Prime Minister of Canada, Mark Carney, said no. He delivered what might be the most important address of Trump's second term so far. To enthusiastic applause in Davos, he articulated a vision of how the middle powers, nations like Canada, should respond to the great powers. It is decidedly not according to Trump's plan. First, Carney spoke the plain truth. For decades, Carney said, countries like Canada prospered under what we called the rules-based international order. We joined its institutions, we praised its principles, we benefited from its predictability. And because of that, we could pursue values-based foreign policies under its protection. But, Carney said, this order was always partially false. We knew that the strongest would exempt themselves when convenient, that trade rules were enforced asymmetrically, and we knew that international law applied with varying rigor depending on the identity of the accused or the victim. Even an imperfect system had profound benefits. As long as America remained both strong and virtuous, American hegemony in particular, he said, helped provide public goods, open sea lanes, a stable financial system, collective security, and support for frameworks for resolving disputes. That all appears to be over. We're not in a state of transition, but rather one of rupture. That's Carney's word for it, and he's right. This declaration might seem bracing and perhaps even premature. The system is under strain, yes, but ruptured? Really? We could be mere months away from a decisive repudiation of Trump and Trumpism in the midterms. Shouldn't that reassure our allies? Besides, doesn't Trump backtrack all the time? Didn't he just turn down the temperature over Greenland? But consider the reality from an allied perspective. They now know that there is considerable appetite in the American population for at least some form of Trumpism. They know that one of the two American parties is firmly in the hands of people, including Vice President J.D. Vance, who may even be more hostile to NATO than Trump himself. They've watched as former Trump opponents, men like Marco Rubio, have been assimilated into the MAGA machine. As long as that is true, that means the Western alliance will always be precarious. You cannot build an enduring economic order or a stable defense strategy when chaos and confusion are always one election away. It turns out that the much-maligned post-war consensus provided many benefits to America and the world. The Trump theory, to the extent there is a coherent theory, is that America's economic and military might means that we'll benefit from this rupture, will no longer be exploited by freeloading allies, and their own weakness means that we can impose our will. Through tariffs and threats, we can even extort territorial changes, acquiring Greenland from Denmark, and, who knows, perhaps even turning Canada into the 51st state. Our strength used to be their strength, and now our strength is their weakness, a weakness we can exploit. Carney sees this reality clearly. Great powers have begun using economic integration as weapons, he said, tariffs as leverage, financial infrastructure as coercion, supply chains as vulnerabilities to be exploited. Integration, he said, has become the source of their subordination. And so the choice is clear: submit or resist. Carney did not receive a rousing standing ovation because he called for submission. Instead, he marked out a path of allied integration and cooperation that could create, in essence, a new great power rival to the United States. Submission, in fact, was never an option. Proud nations do not agree to become vassals. And so the choice isn't between resistance and submission, but between forms of resistance, whether the middle powers will create national fortresses or enter into new alliances and agreements that don't include the United States. Carney, in essence, says yes to both. Canada, he said, is doubling its military spending and rebuilding its defense industrial base, but it's also entering into an array of new agreements, including, most troubling to the United States, agreements with China and Qatar. And what does that mean for Trump's ambitions for Greenland? Carney could not have been more clear. On Arctic sovereignty, we stand firmly with Greenland and Denmark and fully support their unique right to determine Greenland's future. Our commitment to Article 5 is unwavering. In other words, if Denmark calls for aid in the event of American aggression, Canada will answer, and the standing ovation indicated that other nations would as well. Carney's conclusion was clear. The powerful have their power, but we have something too: the capacity to stop pretending, to name reality, to build our strength at home, and to act together. I'm afraid that years of mockery of allied nations and allied strength have led millions of Americans into a profound error, where we believe that Europe, and other liberal democracies are easily cowed and bullied. Incredibly, there are powerful people in the administration who would seem to believe that we'll be stronger and more prosperous when we're finally freed of the anchor of European weakness and wokeness. This critique was grounded in a measure of truth. Many of the great nations of Europe, Germany most notably, allowed their defenses to decay after the Cold War. Europe did seem intimidated by Vladimir Putin. The European response to Russian aggression in Ukraine in 2014 was wholly inadequate. It was necessary for American presidents to coax our allies into spending more on our shared defense. But what is an appropriate bipartisan movement to persuade key allies to increase their military spending has now morphed into contempt for our allies and our alliances. Out of time for this article. If you are interested in hearing the remainder of it, please call 716-821-5555 and ask for the rest of the article. You've been listening to a reading of articles and features from the January 25th issue of the front section of the New York Times. We read from the front section of the New York Times every Sunday at 1 p.m. Your reader has been Kevin Siepel. Thank you for listening.
Coming up next in the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service, we have a reading of the New York Times opinion page. Following that, at 3 o'clock, the New York Times Arts and Leisure, and at 4 o'clock, a rebroadcast of this morning's Buffalo News. Radio Reading mails out a large print program schedule to our listeners every other month. If you have not received a Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service large print program schedule in the mail, please call us at 716-821-5555. We will make sure that you receive one every other month. A Braille version of the schedule is also available upon request. Our number again is 716-821-5555. The following program is intended for listeners who are blind, have low vision,